Okay. The hymn this morning, we had already scheduled to sing this week. And it's, as you know, when we are doing our hymns, as we have been going through and learning our new, it's not as new a hymnal as it once was, the Community of Christ Sings hymnal. We have been going through a extended process of where Leandro scans the hymns for us, and then we have them in front of us so it's easier for us to sing, and so that it's easier for people joining us online to also have the words in front of them so that they can sing. It's not work for everybody because some of us have different situations with our vision. I myself am going like this some of the time and all that kind of thing nowadays. Anyway, so this hymn was one that we had never sung before in the congregation, and we had it as one of the ones that starred with an asterisk. That means that Leandro has to scan it in order for us to be able to sing it on Sunday. But in fact, what happened was this was sung at the Mission Center conference, which we also did all the scanning for and all the things last week. And so this was a song that we did have a little familiarity with because it was coincidentally or by design sung intention that sung last week. And this was, I think, the one that moved Carrie Richards essentially to tears as he sort of seeing this and these words as very emblematic of where we find ourselves in Community of Christ. That this is never about, no matter how much as human beings we think of things as a story that has chapters and books, and the book actually ends. In fact, our life is a lived experience where the story is never ending. We don't get to a state where you get to happily ever after, because happily ever after implies end, in that sense. Rather, is in the life cycle of church and congregation, we're talking about continual journey, and people have throughout our existence as a church and as a congregation, the people who started the journey over time all pass away and are remembered, and we continue to build on the journey that they start as new people are attracted to the journey and are share the road with us, and we move forward. One of the things that I remember very clearly, for example, John Ford was a lifelong member of this congregation who was amazingly supportive of our renewal plan, our goal as a congregation to start a new chapter in the downtown of the city, and always in his contributions, John directed them towards the building fund because of the renewal plan fund, because he wanted to see, he wanted to plant acorns for oak trees that he wasn't going to personally be there to cultivate or see them ever grow up, and yet as an act of faith, you're still planting the acorns because the journey is ongoing. And so that song that we sang together, I think, is emblematic of that there is how we always restart the journey. We are always going forward. We are always being called out of our zones of complacency into new paths, even though all journeying, all walking forward, all activity like this is costly. It's always easier to simply stay and not do anything. And yet inactivity is in fact also means that nothing is going to happen or can happen. In the journey, we gain new insights, new perspective, and mission. So our theme is actually another hymn from the hymnal, Draw the Circle Wide. And I was reminded of this particular hymn because several times this year I've not been with the congregation here on a Sunday because I've been traveling or any other number of reasons, and I've met with other congregations. So, for example, the Salt Lake congregation, and also the Canada West Mission Center in Saskatchewan. And I found that actually on 3 occasions this year, when I was visiting another congregation, they sang Draw the Circle Wide, which is hymn, it's 273, right? 273. And I realized So I feel like we've sang this hymn a lot. And yet I realized, or Leandro was telling me, that actually it's been a long time since we've actually sung the hymn here in Toronto congregation, although we are going to sing it as our closing hymn, and so we'll think about the words of it then.
Well, we sing it at conferences, at campgrounds, and so I have it
Yeah.
in mind that we sing it all the time, but it turns out never here.
But if you haven't all been with me in Salt Lake congregation, or if you weren't at the campground and all those kind of things, you maybe haven't. But anyway, the idea of it is draw the circle wide, draw it wider still. You let this be our song. No one stands alone when we're side by side. Draw the circle wide, I think is how it goes. I could look it up. And when I was at the Canada West Mission Center conference, this particular hymn was cited by President Vesey as as he's said, essentially has become kind of an unofficial anthem of the church, as we have been engaged for the past half century, especially, but I mean even for the whole entire time, but especially especially thoughtful process of prayerful discernment about identity. What does it mean to be in the church? What does it mean to what is the mission of the church? What are our principles? What is our identity? Who are we as a people? And so, with a response to that, as we have, I think, emerged on the other side of what had initially been a questioning crisis, where we were uncertain of our identity, to where we are now, and we're envisioning an ever-broadening identity, is this idea of drawing more and more people into our journey and being more and more open to the transformation that occurs when we are walking with different people with diverse traditions. So our very first mission initiative that we have built into our wall here, invite people to Christ, invite everyone into community, as we've understood it in the 9-pointed star here in our particular iteration of this in Toronto congregation, representing the 9 enduring principles, which we also always have in front of us as we're talking about who we are, what do we uphold, what are we doing, mission and principles. So our call to worship this morning that Leandro read is this very famous phrase in a vision of Isaiah of a time when war will cease, when the nations will forget war and people will beat their swords into plowshares. And there's a, for example, famous statue in front of the United Nations that also is an incarnation of this particular vision. So the idea that the temple, our temple, that the Temple of Jerusalem represents a holy place, not just for the limited God of one nation state, one little Iron Age kingdom in the middle of nowhere, really, which is what people had understood, let's say, prior to Isaiah's time. So where people in the earlier parts of the Hebrew Bible, the prophets and evangelists who are writing there, often are expressing a vision and an identity where they understand their God in very limited terms. They understand their God as being their own God and not the God of other peoples. Other peoples have other gods who maybe aren't as good as their God, but in any event, those other people are not even really, in the earliest parts of the Old Testament, thought of as being people on the same level. So in fact, they are essentially scourges like plague that your national God, your own little God, uses to keep that God's own people on the path of righteousness. So we've seen that many, many times, for example, in the Exodus story, where essentially God not only tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and demand to let the people go, but God also is the actor who hardens Pharaoh's heart in the Exodus, because the author of Exodus doesn't envision Pharaoh, doesn't envision the Egyptians as being individuals who God is a God of all. Rather, God, the only envisioning is the community itself, the Israelites themselves. That's as far as the perspective had been in that earlier concept. But what we have now with Isaiah, in this call to worship, in this particular scripture, the house of the Lord will be the chief of all the mountains, and all the nations will stream to it, and many peoples will come and say. So in other words, this is not any longer in Isaiah's vision are we understanding our God to simply be one little national God among other gods. We have instead understood our God to be the universal God. But when one does that, one has the uncomfortable implication of understanding then that we are not simply God's only people. That there, in fact, that God is the universal God, is the God of all people. So this is this idea then from a national God to a universal God. There are unexpected implications and uncomfortable implications. It's implications that it took the prophets, the writers of the Old Testament and all into the New Testament, a lot of wrestling with to try to understand kind of the implications of all of this, of what do we mean when we're saying that everyone is a person, and that God is the God of all, not just of one particular people. So, this is, and I've used these slides in a couple different places, but this is part of the whole overall question that we have of identity. So when we draw a circle and we label it as us, we are immediately excluding them just by creating an exclusive identity. This is one of the paradoxes of identity itself. In order to affirm positively identity, one must also essentially also work on affirming negative identity. And indeed, in general, the negative component is often stronger than the positive component. When we're making it bigger, people tend to human nature is to want to make a laundry list of what we aren't, rather than coming up with all of the wonderful things about what we are. So there's a border, and it separates us from them, this list of what we are and aren't. The reality, of course, is that there is a massive diversity between them and between us. So although we often will reduce this, and we just look outside of them and not see them for all of the complexity and diversity that they have, the reality is that people who aren't us have amazing diversity and are not all one kind of thing. And we learn that through experience, and we also have been focusing on that in a faith community sense here in Toronto congregation with our lessons on all of the world's different diverse faiths. We also know that us is not all one thing either, that we ourselves also have an amazing diversity of where we are at, and we have a part of our identity now has been to positively affirm that we embrace that diversity. In other words, that we don't all have to have the same opinion, we don't all have to be on the same page. And we spend, for example, this morning our class, which we have, as a discussion where we each kind of affirm where our own position on different issues. In this case, we were talking about war and peace, nonviolence, and this sort of thing. And it isn't that there is one right answer that everyone must be on that page in order to be us. In fact, you can be us and have quite different opinions. That hasn't always been true in our tradition. This painting, we have a copy hanging on our wall. This is a painting by David Hiram Smith, the son of Joseph and Emma Smith of Nauvoo. And although it's quite an idyllic painting, and it's a painting of kind of a beautiful childhood memory, it nevertheless is a painting of Nauvoo as a ghost town, Nauvoo as a failure of an experiment. So the most prominent building there, the Nauvoo House, is the unfinished hotel of which only the basement and the first floor of the 3 envisioned floors were ever built before the city had to be abandoned. And so part of the issue there was this same identity issue of us versus them. When my great-great-great-great-grandparents were in Nauvoo and helped to build that community, they defined themselves as the one and only true church, and they looked outside at their neighbors and they labeled them all as Gentiles. In other words, we are the true Israel, and everyone outside of our community, including Jews, are all Gentiles, really. So in other words, this is because this is we're essentially possessed of the one and only true faith. And undoing that, unfortunately, they forgot the diversity among their neighbors, where so many of their neighbors in Illinois had been there when they had left and been forced out of Missouri as refugees. And they were welcomed into the homes of these Gentile neighbors who took the refugees in and fed them, clothed them, helped them get a new start, a fresh start. Nevertheless, now that they are all just considered them, they all just considered Gentiles, all of the people who were antagonistic towards our community, they were seen as being essentially emblematic of a group that wasn't perceived as diverse. In other words, there were all sorts of Gentiles who were anti-Mormon, who were opposed to the saints. But nevertheless, they weren't all that way. But our strong sense of us versus them identity made us lose track of that fact. So our lectionary reading this morning is from the Gospel of Mark, and it concerns one of the famous faith healings that Mark records about Jesus. And so it begins, they came to Jericho, and this might be an interesting little place in the Gospel of Mark where we're actually missing text in the edition that we have, because essentially they came to Jericho, period, and then as Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, so some scholars think, well, wait a second, what were they doing in Jericho? What's the point of that part of the story? And there's some indications that there was some other part of the text that's been lost. But anyway, as Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on his way. So I think that in some cases where we are now in the 21st century in Christianity is that we are sometimes uncomfortable with the miraculous, with what seemingly literarily are told as supernatural events that occur in the gospel and other accounts. And I want to just talk a little bit about the idea of healing as it was understood in antiquity and actually the Middle Ages. We are pretty aware, I think, in our exegesis, in our study of the New Testament, of the difference between ritual purity and our understanding of bacteriology of modern cleanliness. So for example, this is a mikveh bath, which is for ritual washings at Qumran, so at the Essene community where the Dead Sea Scrolls were located. So this community of ancient Second Temple Jews, this Essene community, which kept the Dead Sea Scrolls, were very interested in purity, but not purity the way that we understand it, because of course modern ideas, understandings of bacteria and all these kind of things were not had. And so essentially the idea of ritual purity is that when you encounter different components of different things that are ritually impure in your life, so for example, encountering the deceased, encountering blood, any of these kind of issues cause a condition of ritual impurity in Torah law, in Jewish law, for which someone who is an adherent of particular interpretations of that law then must ritually purify themselves in a mikveh bath. Essentially, the bath is something that is hard to have when you're living in the desert like this. Water is hard to come by, but it's even harder to come by because it has to be living water, so it has to have not been drawn. You can't take buckets or pump or something like that and to fill it. It has to be able to have come by natural runoff, and so they had to create an irrigation system so that rainwater would make it to fill these baths. But because the entire community is using these, and because that only the refilling of it only happens occasionally, maybe every 6 months or something like that, and you may well be having a ritual bath very frequently, this water would become quite filthy. This is not cleaning in the way that we understand cleaning. This is also true, for example, we think of like I was at the aqueducts and we're seeing all the baths and all the Roman ruins. So the Romans were obsessed with bathing and things like that. One of the interesting things though is that they hadn't invented soap. And so they washed using olive oil and lots of water. And it's only the smelly German barbarians who had actually invented soap that changed washing to the kind of thing that we have. Well, in that same way that we can understand that there's a very big difference between ritual purity and actual cleanliness as we understand it now, there was also something very different between faith healing and modern medicine. So as we know from the gospel accounts, Jesus is quite interested in putting, for example, ethics and inclusion ahead of ritual purity. So the story of the Good Samaritan, as we know, is one where the people who are adherents to law, the Pharisee and the priest, the scribe, pass by what they think might be a dead body because if they didn't, they would have incurred ritual impurity and would have had to go and have this whole purification process. They would have missed Sabbath observance and all this sort of thing. And instead, it's a Good Samaritan who isn't worried about those kind of laws, that is instead worrying about ethics and your neighbor. And this is the message that Jesus is trying to give. In other words, we should be more worried about ethics and inclusion than we should be worrying about ritual purity, even though ritual purity is what the law requires. Likewise, ritual healing is absolutely different from what we understand in modern medicine. It has only been about a century and a half that modern medicine has had any sort of effectiveness. Before that, there are some things that doctors could do, like amputate and this sort of thing that were actually helpful. But many of the ideas in the West even are simply not helpful. Everything from bloodletting and any other number of ways that people understood medicine were actually often not helpful. And the main thing that would have been helpful is simply caring about the wound and essentially giving yourself a time to recover from any kind of illness is more or less how healing and medicine worked functionally. But what absolutely did happen then, prior to having effective medicine, was that when somebody was in a condition of ill health, that is just the same, functioned just the same as ritual impurity, where that person then was often not able to work in their normal function and were often then relegated to the outskirts of society, the margins of society. So we understand this in terms of lepers, even though not all of them had leprosy in the terms of any one particular disease. We're talking about people with various kinds of conditions who are not part of the body of the society, who are reduced only to begging and things like that because they have been marginalized. And Jesus's model, I think, is one of inclusion. Let's go to the people outside our circle. Let's invite them in. And indeed, his model of healing, ritual healing, ends up being adopted then by early Christianity. And we have throughout all of antiquity and the early Middle Ages examples and examples and examples of people who, for various reasons, understand themselves to be infirm. They have left the center of society and they are on the margins. Then they go to a cathedral. They go to the relics of a saint. They pray for a healing miracle. They have a public healing, and they undergo that healing, and then they are brought back into society. And so really, the healing that is actually occurring here that's really important, there may well be any number of medical things that are also happening. But the thing that's most important here is Jesus as social healer and essentially this gospel of inclusion. So we were just in France, and we saw a 4th century sarcophagus which has some of the earliest images of Jesus. Jesus is actually again and again and again represented 7 times here on the sarcophagus in performing different sorts of amazing feats that the deceased obviously felt was very important. Everything from the resurrection of the dead to the multiplication of bread, the transformation of wine. And the last 2 on the right here are Jesus curing the blind man, Jesus curing the cripple. And in these cases, again, this is a ancient artwork technique of Jesus is the important person, obviously, as compared to the people who are getting healed. But you can essentially see the unbearded, toga-clad Jesus here doing those particular types of healing. And so this healing component, this social healing, was incredibly important in early Christianity. So I've talked about it then. The idea then of purifying and healing is the idea of inclusion. In other words, taking people who have been shunned and drawing the circle wider to include them. So this is, of course, hugely relevant to what we've been talking about recently, our 3/3 strategy of how are we to be an inclusive people, to draw the circle wide, a congregation and mission, creating connections, and ultimately new expressions. So this principle that we have is the enduring principle of unity and diversity. And so as we, as a congregation and mission, create connections with new people, for example, in our Tuesday and Thursday group, with people who join us online, we are right now experiencing new expressions of what it means to be a community emerging here in Toronto. So just as we were, anyway, have been transformed as a church many times in the past, so between Jesus' time to the Roman Empire, to the Middle Ages, to the Protestant Reformation, what we have been trying to do is to transform so that we can translate gospel principles to ways that are relevant in the 21st century. So as we have been inviting seekers to engage with us, we are experiencing transformation as we grow together. And so this is what we now have defined essentially church as being, which is to say disciples, people like us who are already committed to this mission, engaging with new seekers in missional activities so that the work that has been started long before us can continue to grow in oak orchards that are continuing to move the mission forward. So draw the circle wide, wider still, let this be our call.